Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about text structure. Just a quick side note before we get started, I am recording in the teacher workroom at the end of the day. So if someone walks in behind me or there's an announcement, I'll try to pause it, but I may get interrupted and I do apologize, but I'm going to keep rolling the best I can. But if there are interruptions, please just ignore that and I do pre-apologize. So what is text structure? So text structure is the way that an information is shared. It's the way that information is organized in the piece. So it's based basically around what's the purpose of the text and what's the best way to do that. So what message am I trying to get across and what's the best way to do that? We typically already think of text structure in terms of nonfiction. You guys have probably seen these text structures before. Um, Description is like your sensory details when you're really getting descriptive about something. Compare, contrast, you could do that in your sleep when you're comparing more than one thing. Order and sequence is like time order when you are telling a story or you're
Bianca
describing.
Sanchez, please report to the car line. Bianca Sanchez to the car line.
When you're describing something in order, like time order of it happening, like this morning I woke up and then I went to Starbucks and then I came to work and I taught 3 classes and then I went to lunch. All of those things happen in order, so that's order and sequence. Problem and solution is like if you wrote an article on pollution and you talked about the problem first and then you proposed how to fix it, that's problem and solution. And then cause effect is like a problem. I'm sorry, a cause effect is like a cause and then what is the effect of that. So like if I talked about my weekend and how I had so much fun this weekend and I did not study at all, and then I talked about on Monday how I took the test and failed it, the cause would be, the weekend having so much fun, and the effect would be, well, I failed the test because I didn't study, right? So these are the ones that you have probably seen before, which is why I'm flying through this slide. But if you want a printout of this, just let me know because I will definitely get it for you. Or if you have any questions, just see me. But these, I think you guys have seen a bunch of times. So just let me know if you have any questions or if you want this printed out. Okay, so for today, we are going to be looking deeper than that though, because I think you guys have seen that other stuff already. We're going to be looking at narrative and non-narrative. So what does a narrative structure look like versus a non-narrative structure, and how can you tell the difference? So a narrative text is basically a story. Okay, when you think narrative, think story. It uses a narrator, so that is someone who is the voice to tell you what happens. A narrative obviously has at least one character because you got to have a character because they're telling the story. So the narrator is a character. Most narratives use dialogue, speaking between characters. Obviously, I say most because only stories with at least 2 characters can have dialogue. We'll get into that more in just a minute. And dialogue is really important because it can be used to give information and move the plot along. And I'll give more information on that in 1 second. Hold on.
Tell you were doing something at home.
No, you're fine.
Ruin it. What did you do here before you recorded?
So this is a narrative example. And so if we look at the example, it says, "Well, husband," said the wife, "what did you catch today?" "Well," said the man, "I did catch a talking fish, but it said it was a prince under a spell, so I let it go." "Oh dear," said the wife, "did you make a wish? Such a fish could grant us that. You must call it back. Our house is so small. Wish for a big castle for us, and be quick." So what can you tell from the example? That's a rhetorical question. The big thing to notice is that just from a few lines of dialogue, we can tell a lot. So we can tell there's at least 2 characters. There's the husband and the wife. There's a hint of a third character, maybe the talking fish. Does it come back? We don't know. But there's definitely some involvement of a talking fish. You can tell the husband and wife might not agree. They have different perspectives on what the husband should have done with the fish. the husband wanted to let it go. The wife thinks that he should go get it back and make a wish. So we see a little bit of the conflict and the disagreement amongst the two characters. So we can tell a lot just from just a few lines of dialogue, which is why dialogue is super important in narrative writing. However, narrative writing doesn't always have dialogue, and I just say that because if there's not two characters, you can't have dialogue. So the narratives that only have one character is not going to have dialogue, and I just mean just the speaker themselves. So it says some narrative texts do not use dialogue. Sometimes the narrator is the only voice in the text. So there's no other character, so there's no one to speak to, basically. These types of narratives still tell about events, they still tell a story. They just do so from one person's point of view or experience rather than multiple people's. So an example of a narrative without dialogue looks like this. In 1862, I was 10 years old. My family moved to the prairie that year. I was unhappy about leaving Virginia, the only place I had ever lived. I knew I would miss it terribly. I blamed the United States government for my problem. Congress had passed a law that year called the Homestead Act. The act promised free land to almost anyone who wanted it, but the land was located out west on the American frontier, far from my Virginia home. So you can still tell a lot from this. Even though there's no dialogue, you can tell that the narrator had a bad experience as a child. Obviously, they moved, and this experience caused her feelings of great sadness when she looks back on it. So we can also tell maybe this is a little bit of a historical fiction because it's set in a real time in history. So there's definitely a lot going on in this passage, even though there's no dialogue. All right, so fiction versus nonfiction. So when we think of narrative, we automatically think of fiction because narratives are stories, right? So stories are fiction, right? And that's what we automatically go to. So we're going to be looking at how can you tell the difference between narrative fiction and narrative nonfiction. Just as a quick review, fiction is made up characters and made up stories. Nonfiction is true. And if I go too fast on any of this, you're welcome to back up and take some notes and hear me re-explain some things, or you can always see me and ask questions. So narrative fiction. This is what we think of when we think of narrative. We think of stories and characters and fun plots and made up, characters. These are your Hunger Games and Harry Potters and, The Giver and Fault in Our Stars and all these fun books that we love to read. So anything with fiction in it, it's a work of the imagination. It's not real. This is your science fiction, detectives, mysteries. These characters are not real people and the events did not really happen. Versus nonfiction, this one you have to think about a little more. Like, wait, narrative nonfiction? What? Because narrative, but you think stories. But narrative nonfiction, if you break it down, the word narrative means story and the word nonfiction means true. So it's just a true story. That's all it is. Narrative nonfiction means true story. Officially, it says on the slide here, they're about real people and events, such as biographies. It's a true account of a person's life. An autobiography is also nonfiction. It's a true account of a person's life written by that person themselves. Can also include letters, journals, diaries, speeches, essays, and opinion pieces. So again, narrative nonfiction is just a true story. So pretty simple. So then we're going to look at what is a non-narrative. So we looked all of those examples of narratives. Now we're going to look at non-narrative. So the word non, actually the prefix non, means not or the reverse of. So if I say, she is talking nonstop in my class, I mean, that talking doesn't stop. She never stops talking, right? So nonstop means it doesn't stop. So a non-narrative is just simply not a narrative. It's something that is the opposite of a narrative. It's not a narrative. So it's something else. It does not have a narrator. So a non-narrative text does not have a narrator. It does not use characters. It doesn't use dialogue to give information. Instead, it shares information by just stating facts. So the best way I think of this is like a textbook. If you've used a textbook in your classes, it's a non-narrative text. It has information that's broken down into chapters, tables, charts, graphs. Basically, when you think of nonfiction text, it's usually non-narrative and vice versa. This means that they're about people, places, and events that are real. So just to be clear, you can have narrative nonfiction and you can have non-narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is going to be stories that are true, but non-narrative nonfiction is it's about the structure. We don't have a narrator anymore. We don't have characters. It's not a story. It's fact-based. That's the difference. So here's an example. And I don't really want to read this whole thing to you because I know you guys can read. So if you want to read it word for word, just pause it and read it. But it is talking, it's like a little short article about glass. So that bold up at the top is talking about glass. So it's like glass has many useful traits. It's fairly easy to make and doesn't it cost much money? It could be made for these reasons. So it gives you information about glass in a clear and direct way. So it's strictly informative. There's not a narrator, there's not dialogue, there's not characters. It's straight informative. That makes it non-narrative. As it says in the bottom, there's other types of non-narrative. So does your science class have a lab? If yes, lab reports are non-narrative. Book reports. Let's see, current events, news articles, timelines. I'm just kind of skimming here. Again, you can pause this video at any time and read this word for word. But basically, non-narratives are like nonfiction texts. They don't have characters. They don't have dialogue. Okay, so to review. Narrative is a story told by a narrator that often uses dialogue. Okay, we have talked about that a little bit. Narrative fiction is what we usually think of when we think of narrative, so short stories, novels, etc. Narrative nonfiction are true stories. Okay, so biographies, autobiographies. A non-narrative is basically nonfiction. That's an easy way to think of it. So most of the time it's nonfiction. It uses facts and is true. The biggest thing I don't want you guys to get confused is narrative nonfiction and non-narrative nonfiction. Okay, narrative nonfiction, one more time. Narrative nonfiction is a true story. Okay, we still have characters, we still have a narrator. Non-narrative, nonfiction is going to be not a narrative. It's still true, but it's not a narrative. It's fact-based, it's informational. Okay, so what you're going to do when I'm finished talking is you're going to click over to the next Nearpod slide and you're going to take a quiz, and it's going to give you some passages and you're going to tell me, is it narrative, is it non-narrative, narrative fiction, narrative nonfiction, what is it? So you're going to have to read a few passages. As I said before, this is the last thing I'm saying, and then I'll be quiet because you guys have been listening for a long time, so kudos. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, please come see me. If you need a printout of any of this stuff, if you'd like to have it, especially that first chart, I can get that for you. Or you can go back and pause any part of this video and take some notes. If there's a part that confused you or you are one of those people who learn best through writing, then you can go back and pause the video and take notes of the slide that's on the screen. That's also an option. So let me know if you have any questions. And if not, then you can go ahead and click over to the next slide and take the quiz. Good luck.